This episode, I'm joined once again by Aaron French to discuss the concordance between the work of Rudolf Steiner and George Gurdjieff. I'd like to thank all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast, gain access to some exclusive content, or just keep everything running, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Aaron French, thanks once again for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
We're going to be discussing the overlap between the work of Rudolf Steiner and George Gurdjieff, and sort of respectively, you are an expert on the work of Rudolf Steiner, and I have spent ridiculous amounts of time researching and practicing the work of George Gurdjieff. So, I don't think within the esoteric sphere, the word expert or professional or scholar is like, I'm not really interested in it. But we've both spent a lot of time with these figures. And it's interesting. The dates that we're looking at, really, I mean, Steiner is 1861 till 1925, and Gurdjieff is 1866 or 1877, sometime between there, till 1949. So pretty much a direct overlap between the two. And I spent last night trying to really dig deep into whether or not they met. And unless you know something I don't think they did. I don't think they ever met, which is really strange. I thought they would have sought each other out, or maybe, if we're to go off sort of the masters of the world, they had a sort of unspoken, you're doing your thing, I'm doing my thing.
And it's interesting because I don't think they met that I know of, but there are cases where Steiner says things to people who come see him who are from another country or something, to go to back to this country where you're from, because there's another master there. And so he's the right one, go back and do this. So he did have some kind of at least idea, according to these stories, that, there were many around and doing their thing,
Yeah, I think that's pretty much how I'm feeling. And Gurdjieff was very big on that himself, of there are multiple routes up the mountain, the metaphorical spiritual mountain. And the one which will probably work best for anyone is the context that their essence has grown within, which we'll probably get to later. But to really, I guess the point of this isn't necessarily a biographical overview of either, but whether or not this strange segment in time from the 1800s through to the mid to late, sort of the 1970s is when serious esotericism mainstream stops with Tomberg. Whether or not this strange, what's going on in this strange period, and whether or not there's overlaps between I would say arguably what are the two biggest figures at this time. Is there anyone who else would be big at this time? I mean, theosophy is at its peak and then dying in this period.
I mean, there are definitely other people, like Crowley is still around to a certain extent, and Annie Besant, I think, is sort of leading the charge in what was left of Annie Besant and Leadbeater were trying to do their thing with the Theosophical Society, and they had Krishnamurti. These people were around. You had some, Golden Dawney type people who after that fell apart, doing things in France, and then a whole host of stuff related to spiritualism and whatever is still going in the US. But it is true that particularly going into the 60s, even though I'm not suggesting we bring Crowley in here, in the 60s, in the US, three major figures that became studied were these three: Gurdjieff, Steiner, and Crowley, to a lesser extent, something in the hippie generation is what I'm sort of referring to. And Sri Aurobindo is there a little bit. But I do think it's safe to say, and who's the other one? Nicholas Roerich. So there's all these guys running around. But it is, for sure, Gurdjieff and Steiner were two major figures at the time. In fact, I found a news article from the New York Times, I think it was, an old one from 1925 when Steiner died. And they ran an article about, him passing and so forth. So even in the States, he got an obituary in the New York Times.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing which has been wiped out by not necessarily wiped out by history, because obviously the history is still there if you look for it. But there was a public fever for these things. There's a great book for Gurdjieff called Gurdjieff called Gurdjieff in the Public Eye, which collects the majority of the newspaper articles that we get. And some of them really were full page, what are these people doing in France? Who are these strange what were called forest philosophers at the time? So there was this very public esoteric fever at the time, in this era. But I guess to crack this open, really the first thing that you deal with Gurdjieff, who's often, some people would consider him sort of the patriarch of esotericism, very hardcore, very to the wire, a lot of stuff you don't really want to hear, is that basically you don't have free will. You can grow your free will, or you can develop your free will. And the important thing, I guess, if you're looking at a basis of theology and esotericism for Gurdjieff, is we don't have souls. We're not born with souls. We, quote unquote, metaphorically earn our souls, and they are grown throughout our life. And that's whether or not you continue through to whatever it may be and actually have a soul, or something which in many esoteric spheres would be called like the astral body, or some other etheric body, which is the thing which can continue without the physical body. That soul which allows that is grown from practice while we are alive, spiritual practice while we are alive. And this, just to give like what I see as the three strange currents of what's happening on a grand scale. For Gurdjieff, you have this one chance, this one time. So it's like, right, you've realized that this is the way things are. This is your one chance to get through. For Uspensky, who will come up a lot, Peter Uspensky, who is Gurdjieff's biggest student and often more well-known than Gurdjieff himself, he would say that it's almost temporarily cyclic. So you have a few rounds, but he did say, and I think maybe this was a little trick on his part, he said, once you realize that that's happening, you're probably near the end of those cycles. So you probably only have a couple more. And then there's a guy who not many people know all that much, but I think it's a great change of this theory, is Rodney Collin, who was a student of Uspensky, who was actually a Catholic. And he said, you have as many goes as you like round, but it's actually the same thing. So it's actually, he tried to integrate Catholicism and reincarnation, and somehow it works because actually you're the same soul. So it still actually allows the resurrection. But the main thing is, you don't have a soul, you got to earn a soul. What's going on with Steiner in this respect?
Yeah, that's interesting. It is a bit more of that's a bit more harsh message, it is similar with Steiner, but I don't think it's so harshly formulated in that, of course, Steiner is also harsh when you read some of his lectures and so forth, when he's talking about these themes like this. I mean, sometimes he's in a public setting and he's trying to introduce anthroposophy to many people. He takes a very cautious, very general approach, but in his more private lectures, he can be pretty blunt and but never as much as I've seen reading about things about what Gurdjieff did with his students. So that's also interesting. But I think one thing I would say about that is, Steiner still maintains a Christian thing, a teleology of a kind. It's just a spiral rather than just a pure round and round cycle of death and rebirth, which for him, in a certain sense, this is also a misunderstanding of some aspects of this, although this idea does exist in various forms in Hinduism, in Vedic religions, well, not in Vedic, but just whatever Brahmanism, whatever we want to call Hinduism, even though this is a group of many things. This idea, and then in later forms of Buddhism, this sort of cycle of birth and re-death that you're stuck in, right? Mm-hmm. Steiner doesn't see it this way. And in fact, he criticizes some theosophists for sort of holding to this, and that for him, it's he tries to link it back to old Platonic Pythagorean ideas of a metempsychosis. He tries to say, like, the ancient Greeks had an idea of a soul coming back again. Mm-hmm. It's just that Christianity and it was even sort of built in to Christianity at the beginning. And he talks about passages in the scriptures about, here's John again, or here's the prophet, Isaac is returned to us. I don't know the exact ones, but there are several passages where one could try to interpret them as some form of souls revisiting, or at least influencing again. And so he says this is sort of evidence that in these Abrahamic religions, there was some kind of idea about that early on, which was lost over time. And so he's trying to say, but it's different. We need to go back to this kind of idea here. And, he's speaking in Central Europe mostly, but also, and he does go to England and some other, Scandinavian countries. And so in his mind, he's speaking for this group, This is this group. And it's not just a Eurocentric thing, although one could find elements of that. if you just read what he says, in his mind, this is the group that's has the most potential to help in the current situation. Why? Because it's this group that has brought the world to the state it is through things like colonialism, he talks about, and also through the development of modern science and materialism and technology. So this group has sort of spread these ideas throughout the world. So therefore, it's kind of up to this group to now, figure out a way out of this, because these people, he says, other cultures are not stuck in this like we are, So therefore, we have to find something within our own history to like get us out of this in order to like meet these other cultures who aren't in the same position that the Europeans found themselves in, according to Steiner in his time. It's a long way of trying to figure out, what I'm talking about here. The idea of reincarnation as being a spiral, so that not all souls incarnate, according to him. He has this whole idea about how some souls get tempted at what he calls the hour of midnight, in this between death and rebirth. There's like a moment where Lucifer comes to you and tries to tempt you to stay up there where it's nice and warm and fuzzy, and not come back down here. So not all souls come down here, but the ones that do come down here are here to develop themselves. And when they, and they either do or they don't. And of course, as his whole cosmology develops, there are, like we've talked about Ahriman on this show, things show up to make it even more difficult. And as materialism develops, he even says in some lectures that there is a way that a soul is eternal, but through some of these technological processes and so forth, which we don't have to go into, but a soul can be obliterated, actually. So then you can't just sort of screw it up and try to come back and do it again. So I think that there's not just unlimited. Like if he goes through he uses the great Platonic year. Plato does talk about the great year. I think it's 2,300 years or whatever. I might be getting that wrong. And he says that you come twice in this, once as a male and one as a woman, according to Steiner. But Plato says something about these years too, similar with his metempsychosis idea. So you incarnate like twice, once every 1,000 years or something. Once as a man, once as a female, to like experience both sides of this gendered binary that is popular in esotericism. And so as this goes on, you either develop, more into these higher states, or you devolve. And then he has, which we've talked about, he has the snares one could get caught in. And if you don't evolve, or you get caught in these snares, well, and I think Gurdjieff has something similar to this. When you die, you in a certain sense become stuck somewhere and become a kind of like, in an abyss of some kind, where people here, evil people here, or evil beings there, can do with you what they want. Use you as batteries or something, or something like this. So there's a way to get kind of stuck somewhere in this lost zone where people just, and he says you're lost there because of your own inability to understand what's happening to you when you die. Whereas if you've used your whole life to develop these ideas and techniques, when you die, you have at least some kind of idea what's going on. And so you can move through this process. But if you've been a total materialist, you have zero idea what happens when you die. And then you can be, taken advantage of and so forth. So that's just about this reincarnation part. But so that's why I think I don't think he necessarily says you have no soul. You start with no soul. I think he does say you start with a soul. You start with an astral body, an etheric body. He says you have physical body, etheric body, astral body. Then you have the I, or the ego, the part of you that can say I. And it's this I part, which is sort of connected to the spirit. And it's the spirit part that reincarnates each time. And is eternal and is you, but it's not just you, it's something much bigger than you. But each incarnation you are given freely this etheric body, which is the formative body, the rhythms of the blood, the nervous system, the shape you have that holds the matter in a certain shape, calls this formative body. The astral body is more like, I guess we'd say, a soul with the passions and images live, and in your desires and your memories. There's sort of an interaction between these two. But I just brought one book to show you. This is the English translation of the First Class, they call it. And these are like the towards the end of his life, he gave a certain number of lectures, 19 lessons or something, to like his most interior school, kept secret forever. Now has been published in some version in English, first in German, now in English. So you can read some of this so-called 19 steps or 19 lessons. And this gives this is much more advanced type stuff, but that's why I wanted to bring this in for this, because in here he talks about, yes, you have an astral body, but it has what he calls three beasts in it. Mm-hmm. And so everyone is born into what he says, kind of lower astral world rather than the higher. And it's the human's job to raise them, to purify this astral body and raise it up to reach this higher world. And you do that through like kind of connecting these bodies. Like if you have your eye, which is your conscious part, this must be infused with the astral body. And but there's these three beasts standing in the way of you doing this. And what are these three beasts? He says, one is fear of the spirit. One is hatred or mocking of the spirit. And one is doubt. The final one is doubt of the spirit. So you have like all of these abilities to develop and raise yourself higher, so that at death something different happens, and you go on. That's kind of the idea. But you're like asleep to it, and there's these blocks, in the way that it's up to you to face them.
Right. There's so much there, and there is a massive
long answer. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. There's a massive concordance there, though, and I would begin with the context thing, because I think both Gurdjieff and Steiner are very hot on this, very keen on this, which is you can't really go too far out of your own context, socially, historically, maybe even nationally, because you just don't have what would probably be understood as a symbolic language to be able to understand what's going on. And this is the reason that Gurdjieff wrote Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, which he sort of says, look, we have these holy texts. We have the Bible, we have the Quran, we have, the Vedas, whatever. These were written within a certain context usually by a certain figurehead, spiritual figurehead, who, or central person. These were written in that time, and like he doesn't say this specifically, but just to give this roughly, you sort of have a bit of time around them where the people within that context would be able to understand them on the correct level of when they were written, right? Because they were written within that context for a specific time and place. The Hermetica would be another one. And as you move away from them, what happens is what he calls wiseacring, where as it's passed on, someone does a little change, and then it's passed on again, someone does a little change. And over time, of course, you end up with a message which is so unfathomably different from the original context, especially over the course of 2,000 years, that you're no longer talking about the same thing. So he says, look, this is why one of the reasons he's written Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, which is his great book of his teaching, 1,200 pages. It's a holy book for now, for this. And I would even say that because things are speeding up, even now with what we would say the third or fourth generation of people who are interested in Gurdjieff, even now there's parts in that you go, man, the context has already changed here. There's already this impasse of the ability to understand it on that internalized level of what people would have understood when they were directly reading it. Yeah. And so that's that one thing of just staying in the context, because otherwise you can't really do anything. Now, one thing I want to move to is Plato, I think, is probably maybe the key philosophical link for both thinkers, where Steiner perhaps takes Plato a bit more in that very grand theological sense, and Gurdjieff takes Plato, there's no reference. One of the troubles with Gurdjieff is, of all the stuff I've read on Gurdjieff, he references probably at most 10 other books. He doesn't, so he never mentions Plato, but he does rely on this story of the the carriage, the horse-drawn carriage with the driver, which for him is to do with the three internal, what he calls centers of man. So you have the carriage, which is the body of man, the physical center. You have the driver, which is the intelligence, the intellectual center. And then you have the horse, which is the emotions, the emotional center. So you can imagine this driving along. The intelligence is in control of the body. Yeah, we want to do this. All of a sudden, your emotions draw you off. The big problem with this really is all three parts of this are speaking different languages, right? Intelligence isn't the same as emotions. They can't speak to each other. And that's what you're slowly learning to do on a psychological level, or you could say a spiritual psychological level. Now, what's this got to do with Plato? You have the Phaedrus. You have the Phaedrian chariot, which is as I understand it, the two horses, one which is, which way is the soul going to be taken? And it's now sort of read as, is it going to be taken towards the passions, or is it going to be taken towards something higher? Really, you have almost a lower and a higher will there. Now, with respect to these, just to draw in what you were talking about in raising the lower to the higher, which is very key across all esotericism, really, as above, so below, or even, the Our Father. When we speak of these centers with Gurdjieff, you do actually have the higher emotional center and the higher intelligence center. So there is always this drawing from below to the above in a sense of like a holistic, using all three centers at once to become a balanced individual, which is what he would call number 4 man. Now, now again,
is this also an awake? This is a person who has woken up who has done this. Is that
that
right?
would be someone who is understood to be awake. So you have 7. You have 7 men for Gurdjieff. Man number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Man, 1, 2, and 3 are basically all the same in the sense that man number 1 is. I can basically get this wrong because it doesn't necessarily matter for the 3 men, but they're to do with the 3 centers. So man number 1 would be, he's all intelligence, or he's emphatically intelligent. Occasionally the emotions and the body come in. Man number 2 is just emotions. Man number 3 is mostly physicality, right? So they're unbalanced. Man number 4 is someone who's balanced them all, and this is really where the process of spiritual growth begins. Then you go through to man number 5, and really I believe man number 7 is what would be called, like, in most people understood it as, this is someone who's enlightened. There's Joseph Azizi, who's written on Gurdjieff. He actually says that when Christ comes into it, he would say that Christ should be man number 8 because it's something more. Now, what has this got to do with the whole thing? What has this got to do with, like, maybe the structure of Gurdjieff's thought? And maybe to try and find what would be going on with Steiner here is we have this thing called the ray of creation. Now, very simplistically, in other schools, it would be called as above, so below. Now, the ray of creation is do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do on one side. That is one way, which many people would know as the solfege or the major scale. Now, you begin with do, like the process begins with do. You could really think of any process beginning in this way. Then it goes through to the moon, right at the bottom, which is under 96 laws. Then the earth, under 48 laws. All planets, under 24 laws. The sun, 12 laws. All suns, 6 laws. All worlds, 3 laws. And the absolute, which is under 1 law. So you can think of the absolute, I believe, as God, because it's like, well, it's God under, what's God under? He's only under his own law, which is God himself. Now, why is this interesting, and how does this, like, Gurdjieff is a very, very practical thinker. He wouldn't give you this unless he actually thought you could do anything with it. Man, of course, is inhabiting the earth, so he's under 48 laws. We don't really know what these 48 laws are. This is up for us to sort of work this out in a way. And in the sense that man grows, in the sense that you were talking about in maybe what Steiner would agree with, in sense of going up to something higher. It's not so necessarily going up to something higher, but you're drawing down an understanding from the spheres, which are higher. But in the sense you're drawing something down, you would then become under less laws. Now, the thing, one area I'll make sure we want to focus on, because I think there's a real key connection between Gurdjieff and Steiner in this respect, is there is also involution. There isn't just evolution. There is, generation and degeneration. I think that's the important thing for both these thinkers, which you don't see much before now, is that there is, on this ray of creation, there is the moon. And this is what Gurdjieff says all the time to his students. He says, just make sure you're not food for the moon. Don't be food for the moon. Which, like, if you go into a Gurdjieff group and someone says, we're here to be not food for the moon, you'd think, right, I'm leaving. I'm out of here. But food for the moon is basically when you allow yourself to just be asleep, when you allow yourself just to be drawn by, like, what many people would be, that moment in life where driving is the best instance, I think, of this, is you drive from one place to the next and you get there and you sort of, like, something clicks and you're like, oh, I'm here. And you literally couldn't recall what's just happened. How did I get here? Yeah, right. You've been asleep. And really at that point, you're being food for the moon. Now, I can go into what food for the moon is, but for now, I'll give you that. And I would say that also Earth relates to the physical body. All planets relates to the astral body. Then you have the mental body. Then you have the fourth body. And above that, who knows? You have the cosmic body, but
Yeah.
there you go.
No, thank you. There are lots of similarities, actually. And it's interesting to hear you describe it and then to think about how I would describe it, because both of these, this is also a thing of this time, is these esoteric thinkers develop these grandiose systems, right? To try to, explain this in some kind of new way, some kind of new philosophical way that in their mind is fits better for this time, that people could actually do something with,
Mm-hmm.
But because of that, they're quite complicated. They're quite elaborate. And, in many of these groups, like similar to if you go to an anthroposophical group, if you're a new person and you walk into Food for the Moon group, or if you walk into this Ahriman group, it's very easy to be like, what are these people talking about? And why is this even important? It's because it is such a, it's complex. It's very kind of, it's very esoteric. And it does require a certain commitment, personal commitment to understand it. But it's very easy when one is talking about these things, because they're so complex, to just wander in a sort of field of all of these concepts and notions, But they're, it's just part of the package in an interesting way. So there's sort of, especially in a talk like this where we're going to compare them, there's really no way around this, because both of them did this. 1,200 page book from Gurdjieff, 6,000 lectures. How is one even to begin to comparing these sorts of things other than going through these concepts, right? Which these concepts are in a certain sense, either one knows about them or has an idea of them, or they can be completely foreign. And even if you know about them, they can be very complex. And difficult to kind of wrap your mind around. But even as I hear you talking about them, I see many similarities. Just to highlight one about the number seven humans,
Well, seven. Well, very, very quickly, there are two fundamental laws of everything for Gurdjieff, which is one called the sacred law of Heptapadaparshinok, which is the sacred law of seven, and then also the law of Triya Mazzikamno, which is law of three, and the law of seven. These are everywhere. So seven is, you could call it a divine cosmic law.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's the human being as sort of 4 parts, and then these 3 other parts that are more cosmic that they're working on. Like if you develop these first 3 into harmony, you get the fourth. The fourth emerges from the 3, and you have a new fourth whole or whatever. And then there's 3 other ones that could be developed, which are a bit more higher.
You have instinctive center, which you'd never really touch upon, leave it be. It's breathing, hunger, like your body is just doing that. Then you have physical, emotional, and intelligence or thinking center. That's 4 of them. Then you have the sex center, which doesn't really get spoken about all that much, and it's very difficult to find. This is something which almost works correctly, I believe, if all the others are in flow. And then you have higher thinking and higher emotional.
Yeah, well, I can just so Steiner also has the Sevenfold Model. So but it's not explained exactly the same. He has many trinities of things. For instance, one trinity is these 3 beasts I just mentioned. The other one is physical, etheric, astral body, with the I, in a certain sense, is this 4th part, but it's not exactly formulated the same way. He talks about different stages of knowledge, and then he has inspiration as the sort of first level of higher knowledge, intuition, inspiration, then imagination is the second stage of higher knowledge. Intuition is the highest stage of higher knowledge, which is like revealed knowledge. Doesn't need any books, doesn't need any rationalization. It's just revealed to you, something like this. So those are some trinities of concepts in the system floating around over there. But in terms of 7, what's interesting to me as I'm listening to you talk, and now I'm also thinking about, is to what extent this is all supposed to be happening in a temporal realm or not. So, for instance, like I did notice in some more recent translations into English of Steiner, they're talking about second and third humans, translating whatever in a bit differently, I think, than what I've seen before, in terms of what Steiner is talking about, that if you develop this, you sort of develop a second human. And if you develop this, then you develop the third human in this kind of way. So this idea of 7 humans, 7 stages of human, if we want, kind of fits. And, one way to think about this is similar to what you described about this chariot and the driver. This is also an old trope you find in Hinduism, with the horses representing the five senses, and then the chariot driver learning how to control them. It's just the ego gaining control of these sort of unbridled forces or something, which are the senses. But for Steiner, he has thinking, feeling, and willing. Just to put it simply, he splits these three things apart. So there's the thinking part, then there's the feeling part, and there's the willing part. And the thinking is most conscious, willing is second conscious, emotions is second conscious, and willing is the most unconscious. And so you have these three things operating in you in an unconscious way. And part of his development is to actually deliberately separate how they function together in an unconscious way, and then reconnect them through your eye in a conscious way. So that at this point, though, you've earned a certain level of responsibility, because before, in his system, other beings are doing this, particularly angels. He's big on the hierarchies, which I don't know we'll even get to this, but other beings are doing this for you, and it's unconscious. But if you take the reins, now it's up to you to control your thinking, feeling, and willing in situations. You can't when you're driving and unconscious, like the example you mentioned. So this is like the first step. Out of these three comes this fourth conscious human, who's controlling now these three lower ones, or at least consciously aware of them. And this can lead to three higher steps. So there's the 7 here, and that is I don't even remember it because I didn't bring this part in, but it's something like spirit self, spirit something else, and spirit man. I forget the 3. There's like 3 higher ones, which are kind of spiritual centers or spiritual humans, and spirit mensch, it's spirit self, then something else. I'm forgetting that one. And spirit mensch, Geistesmensch is the highest one. And this is like the fully developed human. But the thing is that he, according to him, when you read him, he has these planetary incarnations that the planet is developing. This is where this whole Armon component comes in too, that we've talked about. So it seems to be that he's saying that these higher parts are developing as the planet develops, like through time, But it's not exactly clear if it's temporal, because he's always talking about how these things aren't temporal, and that, are you developing on these planets? If someone pictures a planet materialistically, it's a hunk of rock that's supposed to come into being in Steiner's system 2,000 years from now or something. But this higher part, he's talking about how to develop it, now. So, and he is saying these things aren't temporal. So it's a bit confusing here if he means, as you develop these higher parts, if you're leaving some kind of temporal world, and then you're, in a certain sense, you're at this further planetary stage, this further level of consciousness, but still here,
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's one thing I want to bring up just about the writing and how much they wrote. But before that, in terms of and it sort of connects to what I want to say about the planetary spheres. So in Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, there is definite, very, very cryptic references to that there's likely, there is planetary influences in some sense. But with respect to this, the three centers for Gurdjieff, and then the respective one for Steiner, there is this clear concordance there between. For Steiner, it seems that he's actually splitting these 3 apart and saying, right, now look at the body, now look at the willing, now look at the feeling. Whereas Gurdjieff, he is saying this, but he would be saying just try self-remember, which is where you basically remember yourself. So you are conscious of what you're doing while you're doing it, and you're turning your consciousness back on itself to be conscious of what is being conscious. And in this sense, you sort of keep an eye on your eye, and begin that serious questioning of who is it who, when I say I, which is, rife within pretty much all spiritual literature. But one thing I really want to highlight, which I find such an intriguing difference, and I think in a way it takes us back to that idea of context, is, okay, Gurdjieff did write this 1,200-page book, and then he wrote Meetings with the Remarkable Men, which is the more well-known one because it got a Penguin Classics or something like that. And actually, that's kind of bad because it's taken out of the order that Gurdjieff said we should. Then there is Life is Real, Then Only When I Am, the most awkward title in literary history. And then there was also The Herald of Coming Good. And this was a very short thing. It was meant to be an overview of his ideas, and he retracted it pretty much immediately because he just, I'm not necessarily sure why. It wasn't very well written, and that's saying something for him. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, okay, there is basically these three canonical books for Gurdjieff, and then why there's so much writing about him is all from his students. It's all like recorded history. But in terms of his own writing, there is three books, and it amounts to a lot, but in terms of like the amount of it, there isn't much there, but qualitatively, there's a lot. And so he sort of didn't want to give his students like, here's the guide, here's the manual, right? Oh, you're at this stage, here's the 19 steps. Whereas quite oppositely, Steiner, on the other hand, has 6,000 volumes and seems to want to give his students, the most minute detail of absolutely everything ever. If they said to him, right, I want to know about the color theory of this plant, he'd be like, right, okay, I'm going to go do 4 lectures on it, and you'll know everything you need to know. So I don't know what you make of that difference. It seems to me that Gurdjieff had an emphasis on, so one thing I was just going to throw in just before you, is when he was writing Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, he said, look, my task here, everything is so super, super, super cryptic in that book. You really have to work to get to the core. And when he was writing it, he said, look, my task here is to bury the dog deeper. And one of his students said, do you not mean bury the bone deeper, like a dog searching for a bone? He said, no. Bury the dog deeper. Got to bury the dog. Right? Like, it's that cryptic that even the dog has been buried. And so he really wanted his students to work for everything they wanted, right? It's like, oh, you want something, you're gonna have to dig. Whereas Steiner, it's like it's almost the same, but it's almost like contrary, because he's like, here's everything. Are you gonna bother to study it?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, and part of what it makes me think of first. Before I even answer, I also looked up this thing that I was just mentioning to tell you what it is. So it's the physical body, etheric body, astral body, right? But then you have this, what we call sentient soul, intellectual soul, and consciousness soul. This is something different. Then you have spirit man, or spirit self, life, spirit man. So it's actually 9 here. So it's a 7 thing. It's not 7, so it's 9. So
Gurdjieff does end up at 9, by the way.
Yeah, and this is why it's a bit confusing, because in some places it seems as though he's talking about 7, but here we have 9, and there are many of these triads and then groups of 4 levels grouped together in various ways. But the one I was thinking of was life spirit, which usually comes before spirit man. These are all further levels of consciousness that are being developed, and soul qualities and so forth. So just a point of clarification on that. But the point you bring up about this cryptic thing is really interesting, because Steiner is doing a little of both, but he's mostly doing the opposite of that, he says. And this is because he's following more strongly, I think, in this Theosophical tradition from the Theosophical Society. And what was the Theosophical Society claiming to do was democratize esoteric knowledge. And so if you read Blavatsky, and also Steiner does not really cite sources either, similar to Gurdjieff, especially when he's just giving lectures or whatever. But if you read Blavatsky's books, this is kind of where this all starts. She wrote Isis Unveiled in, I think, the 1880s, I believe, and then she wrote The Secret Doctrine. If you read these books, they're lots of things, but one of the things they are is stuff from the texts of secret societies, of Masonic groups, of Rosicrucian groups, of Sufi groups, or either that she just learned about or she found in, her family. I think it was her father, her uncle, I can't remember, in Russia, had a huge esoteric library. He was a Freemason, and she read this whole thing as a kid. So she put a lot of this knowledge in these books, according to her. Why was she doing that? Because she wanted to give this, she thought it was the time now, because materialism was coming so strong that everyone needed these types of concepts, not just some elite class who could sort of use them against the public, the general public, who had no idea what was going on, basically, because they were kept at this lower level. So she's like, we are democratizing it. Annie Besant carries this forward. Theosophical Society carries this forward. Steiner attached to it, interested in this idea, and I don't know to what extent Gurdjieff is connected to Theosophy. I do know I do know he knew about it and used some of its ideas. I also read somewhere there's an article a person did about him, about how he kind of capitalized on the popularity of it to do his own thing, which someone could say the same about Steiner. So maybe you know more about to what extent was he influenced or connected to theosophical groups. I don't know. But of course, Steiner joined, became the general secretary in Germany, and then broke in, I think, 1913 and made his own group and changed some things. But he still kept this line the whole time about, and for him, it's even more, I think, more not cryptic being the intention, because he says this all the time, there's groups now still trying to keep this stuff secret and I want to let it out. And in fact, people did attack him for doing this. And you can find, for instance, Martinist groups in France were very concerned with him. He had one of his mentors in Vienna named Friedrich Eckstein wrote to him saying, when he was in Berlin, saying, yo, I taught you all this stuff when you were younger in Vienna, and now you're going to start putting it out in lectures. Don't do that. And he said, well, no, I have to. Like, he felt, according to him, compelled to let all this stuff out. So that's one reason why I think and he even says, so I have to he's trying to make it as clear as possible, even though one could argue if it is clear or not. And the other thing he says is he wants to make it a science. So he was a trained philosopher, technical, physicist, basically, in natural sciences. And he was this before he was an esotericist in a certain sense. So he's also really interested in making it a science. And it's a German science. So according to him, it's a rational, clear, not mystical science that he's making. But, people who read Hegel and even Goethe and Schiller and, Schopenhauer, it's not usually clear to people reading it, but maybe within this German tradition, it's clearer, So you kind of arrive with this romantic Naturphilosophie with esotericism trying to be democratized in it. And he's spreading this all over, trying to apply it to practical realms. So I think that's one reason why he's not trying to be cryptic. But just to finish here, however, when you go like this book I showed about the 19 lessons, this is all mantra. It's a bit like reading, it's all given in mantra. It's reading little poetic verses that are supposed to do something in your soul that make no rational sense, So within his own school, they're trying to create images in you, he is trying to evoke the non-rational, the imaginal in you. When you read it, you can tell. So like within his own private group, he's doing one thing. And yet he has this project that I'm not sure if Gurdjieff has, this very still theosophical public project of democratizing esotericism, starting something called spiritual science and trying to get it to take hold in various realms of life.
It's an interesting difference between the two there. Maybe not. I don't want to define it as Steiner being the optimist and Gurdjieff being the pessimist. I mean, this is in the air as well, as you say. I mean, I think famously of Crowley being taken to court because he leaked, all the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Right. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anything came of that because they sort of was like, well, this is all of the same quote unquote perennial truth, so how can it be yours or anyone's sort of thing? And I feel really the same way to be honest, probably for Gurdjieff and Steiner. The difference I would say is that for Gurdjieff, I mean, I think he was more than happy to hand over whatever secrets or knowledge or however you want to define it, that he had, but he was reluctant to do so if someone wasn't at the level where they would be ready for it. It's almost like if you're learning mathematics and you're not at a certain point, right? You look at a certain equation and it's quite literally would be it would be such nonsense that you would just disregard it as anything altogether. And what I would say from that is, it seems that the difference here is that even from very, very early on, Steiner wanted to make it very, very accessible with public lectures, lots of writing. Here, you can go read this. Sort of, a very public democratic thing. And Gurdjieff he did public displays of the movements, and that was really about it. So we'll get to the movements and eurythmy probably soon. But the movements which were these esoteric dances, which he had learnt from sort of ancient tradition. He gave public displays of these, and really this was about all the promotion there was other than hearsay from Uspensky or whoever it might be. And it was, for him, it was sort of like, here's the movements, and if you're in the crowd and you get this internal sense of there's something in these which is pointing to a truth or has some truth in it. You might afterwards say, I want to speak to Gurdjieff about what's going on here. And this is famously in many of the biographical accounts how people actually come to be with Gurdjieff. But outside of this, I mean, he then, all this history is very well documented. But eventually he ends up in Paris with the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. And this isn't a public thing. There's from what I remember, there's a couple of times they did public shows of the movements there. A few people went. I think William Seabrook, I believe, went, and a couple of other more famous journalists went. And a couple of them were like, yeah, there were some all right dances, but other than that, there's nothing special. So Gurdjieff was very like, look, if you don't have that internal thing which can appreciate this, then it's not for you. And I think in a way he does become a bit more closed off from that as time goes on. And I mean, just to give one, maybe the difference between Steiner and Gurdjieff here, with Steiner with his big public lectures everywhere, constantly. Gurdjieff, for one student, most famously Thomas de Hartmann, who became one of his biggest students, in de Hartmann's biography, he talks about, he wants to go meet this Gurdjieff figure. And Gurdjieff knows de Hartmann at this point is a very well-known highbrow composer in Europe, very, very, upper class. Where does Gurdjieff tell de Hartmann to meet him? In a bar which is full to the brim of prostitutes, commotion. It's the lowest place in the city. Gurdjieff is 2 hours late. And he's, this is how he's trying to get people to, he's saying, look, if you want this, you're going to have to work for it. One of his tenets is no one values anything they don't have to, quote unquote, pay for. And, in metaphorically, de Hartmann had to pay for it by putting aside his ego and sitting amongst prostitutes with this strange Gurdjieff fella who kept, talking very at a whisper, making everything stupidly difficult. And there's a strange difference between the two in that Gurdjieff was very protective. He said, look, if you're not ready for it, then it's not for you. And Steiner seems to really want to push it into the culture.
Yeah, I mean, he founded a school for children. He wants to push it into the culture that far that it's the children even are getting some kind of esoteric training, just as they're developing. Another point that might be possible why there's this difference too. Maybe before I go there, though, just one final similarity about they're both doing the same they both have the same project. Like, for instance, about this waking up. It's like to wake up the human, being. And even Steiner has this whole thing about how when you're a child, you're in this kind of dream state. He talks a lot about difference between how you are when you're asleep and dream consciousness and then waking consciousness. And he says, when you're asleep and you dream, you then wake up to a certain extent into like a different kind of consciousness and then face the world this way and then go back to sleep. And he says, when you're a child up to the age of about your first memory, he says, you're in this dream state. And then you slowly wake up out of this dream state. You can't even go back past a certain barrier and remember earlier, into this dream state. And you wake up into a new kind of consciousness, like adult consciousness. He uses this as a metaphor for like, there's another level, to wake up to this spiritual level is like what you do when you wake up. Yeah. It's like what you did from a kid, from a child into an adult. And this process needs to happen yet again into this like spiritual cognition, spiritual awareness. So I think they're both doing this and have their techniques and methods, but perhaps it is to a certain extent a difference of intention and project, as we just mentioned. What's their project? But there's a methodological thing here, I think, a little bit. And another thing that Steiner was very critical about and always criticizing and talking about is sort of difference between old, quote unquote, old forms of initiation and new forms or appropriate forms, according to him, which appropriate to him was this science. You do it like a scientist in this way. This is what he says publicly, at least. But so therefore, you don't join a lineage, and you don't have a master who leads you through the steps of this development of waking up. And he says, in the ancient world and in other esoteric groups, even esoteric traditions, this is how it's done. And I think he was also arguing in this way because I believe, I could be wrong here, that he thought that the Theosophical Society was still trying to use some of these kind of approaches, And he claimed he didn't want to do it this way. But of course, this is a big irony with Steiner that many people claim that he was just doing. He just became the master, But if you read him, he says not trying to do this, don't make a religion. He claims he's not doing it, even if we look back now, well, that's basically what happened. He at least claimed he was not doing it. And so when you're in a kind of spiritual initiatic tradition, like let's say some branch of Sufism, let's say some sort of Zen monastery or something, these kinds of techniques are part of that, between master and pupil. To the master is to lead the pupil, to assist them in waking up through a variety of means that are usually quite radical, are meant to be, or through ritual processes that are also quite radical a lot of the time, to assist this person to wake up. And it's in some systems, it's individual. In some systems, you have like a ritual you go through, and then your relationship with the master, the way he interacts with you, is personalized to help you, even if it's being a dick to you, this is part of like trying to help you wake up, but Steiner doesn't really do that, actually. And in fact, he says he's trying to not do that. According to him, like, that's not the way to do this anymore. Why is it not the way? Because he wants to make it a widespread thing. Mm-hmm. It's not for a master with like 10 students. It's like, a university curriculum for all people. And of course, some people are higher than lower, just like in any type of education. But he seems to want to make this very public, like you said, widespread. And it gets more like this. Even at first, it's a bit more esoteric. And as he's like nearing the end of his life, it's very much, he's changing terminology that he took from Theosophy to really try to make something that would like be accepted in society, as a new form of knowledge. It may, if not accepted, be a competitor. And if you think about it did become really popular. Mm-hmm. So there's something to say for that. So I don't know what you think of it a little bit. I know some of Gurdjieff's background is also different than Steiner's. He supposedly met some of these Sufi groups, Sufi orders. I don't know. Maybe there's a different methodology that's also interesting here.
Yeah, Gurdjieff's background from Armenia, late 1800s Armenia through Greco-Armenian as well. Real, he's growing up in a real hodgepodge of all cultures, all religions. And yeah, I don't want to be the guy who says Gurdjieff definitely met so-and-so, because it's all so cryptic. He was supposedly part of this group, the Seekers of Truth, who met these people, and then they went to these caves and found these forgotten Essene scrolls, etc., etc. This kind of thing where you go, make of it what you will. But I do want to comment on that idea of, the master and the student relationship, because I think there is a similarity, and it does relate to this idea of waking, waking and sleep, which is once again very similar to Steiner. So you have, for Gurdjieff, you have sleep, as in you're in bed, literally asleep. Then you have, when you wake up, Gurdjieff would then call that waking sleep, because for him, you're still asleep. You're just in, to put it in very easily, I guess, quickly understandable terms, you're then just straight into the programming of what would be known as your personality. You're just habitual responses, habitual phrases. You're still asleep, basically. Then you would wake up. And this, to wake up, this would be the harmonization of the three centers. You're big man number 4. You've begun at least to wake up. And then there is one above that, which is conscious man, conscious individual, cosmic conscious. Enlightenment, basically. And whether or not people can fall back from the third state to the second state, whether or not people can fall back to the fourth to the third, they probably can. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is Gurdjieff makes it clear that the only way someone from one step can go to the next step, and this is for this, he has 7, man 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 again. The only way man number 4, for instance, can become man number 5 is he needs to meet man number 5 who's been there and done that and can bring them up. Now, there's a strange materiality to Gurdjieff's work in that there is, because it's a focus on harmony, say man number 4 wants to become man number 5, and of course, spiritually growing, that's what he wants to do. He would need a man number 5 because he needs that qualitative example to get to. But because of this harmony, you also would now need a man number 6 to move man number 5 up, because there needs to be that space. And in that sense, man number 5 would have to bring a man number 4 up. if you see what I mean. Now, that is the relationship between master and student, is this sort of reciprocal, harmonious relationship where we're all in something much, much bigger. Now, I personally, this is just my own personal opinion, in a certain sense, I'm not sure what happened at the end of the Gurdjieff work, because there's a great picture of Gurdjieff right at the end, one of the final pictures of him, sat on a bench, sort of with his head bowed down. And I personally think that perhaps near the end he saw that maybe his work was a failure, because his last words, we are told by Madame de Salzmann, were, "I have left you all in a big mess." And I personally wonder if it was because Gurdjieff is maybe, whether or not he was maybe what he was enlightened or man number 7, whether or not he wanted to give up and move on from his podium. Now, he also had this struggle with master and student, and I think maybe Steiner would have sympathies here, in that he didn't want people to be like, right, I'm on this path now. Like, I'm on this path, boom, like, I've drawn the borders, and there's no more, it's constant for Gurdjieff. It's always going to be an exploration. It's always going to be learning and new experiences which need to be fuel for your growth. And he had a real struggle with many of his more spiritually developed students, notably Orage, the Hartmans as well, where they didn't want to leave him. He said, look, you need to go, and you need to, in a way, wouldn't say find your own schools, but you can go teach this now. And I think in a way he understood that now the way for them to grow is for them to become the teacher. And many of them didn't want to leave him, like they couldn't. And I think maybe that's why I personally think he saw there was perhaps an element of failure there, is because he got to the end and it's almost like the men number 5 or 6 or whatever still needed their man number 7. And his point was, for any of us to move on, you need to move on. You need to have that courage. And this is actually to draw in something very obscure in the Gurdjieff literature. This is where he draws on actually the Gospel of Judas, which is a 3rd century AD Gnostic gospel, about the idea, of course, for many of this would be heretical, the idea that Judas knew his role, and Gurdjieff's reading is that Judas's task to betray Jesus was actually the most difficult of all the apostles, because he knew he had to do it, and not only that, he had to betray his master, which was like this even greater spiritual leap, because he finally had to go out on his own. So I think in that sense, there's this emphasis between both thinkers of, we are moving, to quote Nietzsche, in the 20th century, everyone will have their own individual religion. I think for both of these thinkers, eventually after enough training, it has to be that. And so they never really wanted it to be all that contained. It's like, here's a ton of fuel, have the courage to go do it yourself. I don't know what you make of that, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, actually. I got several thoughts just to go back to, because of more similarities. It's funny, we're just, what are we doing here? We're basically sharing what we know about these people and their systems, because we don't know the other one quite so well. But then as you hear it, you then like see it within your own. Mm-hmm. So It's pretty fascinating, because as you're talking there, it's like, oh, this, and then this, and then this. But of course, there are differences, as we pointed out. But just couple more similarities based on what you just said. One is he didn't have the he didn't have the specificity of this meeting man number 4 to get to meeting man number 5 to raise up to number 5 and this sort of thing.
Well, I will just comment. There's no point in the Gurdjieff work where someone like arises through a door and goes, "You're man number 4." It's a qualitative understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. But if you were, let's say, if you were human number 4 and wanted to raise to number 5, you would somehow have to meet a number 5, whether you knew it or not. And the content of this person's words to you and their being would elevate you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And what Steiner says, not that specific necessarily, but he does say that for people, and again, it's interesting to read his private lectures and then in public lectures. Like in a public lecture, he would say, like, if you want to do this, you start these exercises and so forth. But, and in anthroposophy, they have this whole issue with like, how developed can you be in this lifetime? Or should you just wait till the next lifetime to do these more difficult things? Or maybe you're not ready yet and just do what you can. And so this is also part of the discussion. One of the things that Steiner tells these people listening to him is like, even if you feel unable to develop these into these higher realms of knowledge, one way to assist you in this process, and I do believe he also says that it's kind of not possible to do it without this, is to hear from someone who has seen in these higher registers and tells you about it. And just the fact of just hearing their experience of having reached, or at least perceived or experienced in these higher realms, just the sheer fact of hearing it somehow begins the process in you. It's like part of the step along the path to get there yourself, you know? So that's a little bit similar there. Another thing that, you know, the background of Gurdjieff is difficult to really understand, you know, what's true, what's not. There's also similar with Steiner. For instance, Steiner has 2 different birthdays that are debated, which one is his birthday. Then there is this thing about him meeting. So like for him, he wasn't meeting a Sufi order or something, but he claims to have been met by, he had one teacher who was supposedly an herb gatherer, kind of folk, like a folk initiate or a folk magician kind of person who taught when he was younger, who taught him about the secrets of plants and herbs and things like Paracelsian sort of sounds like ideas or something. But then apparently he met the quote unquote master, the M. And this is like not something he went and said publicly, but it's in letters to, this first came out in a letter to Edward Schuré, actually, where he tells Schuré that I met the master when I can't remember what age he was. He was a younger person before he began this career, obviously, like in his teenage years or in his early 20s. He met the master, and I'm thinking now, like, which master is it? It's like, in one account, it's the Master Jesus, or it's Christian Rosenkreuz incarnated in the flesh. So Steiner's whole system eventually hooks to this Rosicrucian thing, which we haven't even got into yet. I don't know if Richard talks about that. So for Steiner, he met the being of Christian Rosenkreuz, who started this Rosicrucian movement, or was the founder of it, who basically also went and studied with Sufi groups in the story and brought the Sufi knowledge to the West. And had 12 followers, was their master. It was like a European Sufi order. This Christian Rosenkreuz was reincarnated, and Steiner met this person and was essentially initiated by him. But there's another story where either he met the Master Jesus, who is not the Christ spirit, or it was like the Master Jesus was somehow, this is a theosophical concept, the Master Jesus was also present in this Christian Rosenkreuz individuality. I don't remember the specifics, but this is also a similarity that many, not just these two, but Blavatsky has similar background of like, where did she go? She went to all these places. Who did she meet? When was she born? The birth date is, the circumstance of the birth is obscured. Meeting higher, we're taking a very critical approach. It's a sort of legitimizing themselves as meeting these higher individualities, higher personalities that were then allowed them to reach the level they were at. And this was a problem in theosophy because many people then started to claim of like, well, then this master, I'm talking to the master, and he says this, and this, this started to the disintegration. It doesn't mean that the idea of higher intelligences is not a valid thing, but you could see how people would start to use this for their own benefit, and this apparently did happen, and was a problem, and assisted in perhaps how it changed this esoteric movement that we're discussing, how it kind of changed in the 60s into something else, The final thing I want to just mention about this, and I would like to go back to the idea of evolution and involution, perhaps at some point, but it's really interesting what you said about this idea of everyone having their own truth. And is this what they're getting at, Because definitely in Steiner, he does say that. And of course, he's talking about Nietzsche. He's agreeing with Nietzsche in many cases about certain things. He does, though, say that when a person reaches this higher level of knowledge, what he calls higher worlds, if you attain to this knowledge in this higher world, anyone who has done that has a kind of universal understanding of truth. Doesn't mean the truth looks the same, but they would, without having to tell each other, they would like kind of know, either what's right or what's good or what's moral, these kinds of questions, right? So he does say that, but what he says a lot more, though, is about art, about creativity, about imagination, in relation to spirituality, in relation to achieving these higher levels. And here, and this is probably the most difficult for people to do and to understand, and also for us to make sense of it, that there is this like creation of your own higher world in an artistic sense as part of what it is you're doing. I mean, this is, later, this is the whole idea, your thoughts create reality. This is also the beginning of these kinds of ideas. So he's also talking about this, that there's something about the world you experience, reality, which is the content of your thoughts. And therefore, as you develop to these higher states, it's about creativity, it's about imagination. And yeah, you're creating this higher world, but supposedly these higher worlds are all, hang together at some point at the top.
Yeah, I think there would be some Gurdjieffian agreement with that. I mean, Gurdjieff. One thing I would emphasize here is one thing, just to jump in with the biography and his history. He was always fairly adamant to not really care himself about his history. Someone actually at one point asked him about his previous lives, like as in reincarnation or past life regression, and he said, yeah, I know about 3 of them, but I don't care about them, like because it was like, what am I dealing with like right now? Like, he sort of is the ultimate Gurdjieff joke of like, yeah, I know about 3 of them, but I really don't care, like, because he always would emphasize what can you do right now, not jumping ahead, not trying to get lost in abstraction. You'd be saying, focus on your feet, remember yourself right now. Otherwise, you just get lost. And he would always emphasize about it seems to me that his past is mostly known because his followers just prodded him to tell people. Otherwise, he just didn't really care, because once again, it would be that emphasis on the now. And then what did you mention at the end?
The idea of truth, sort of artistic creativity of higher worlds, but then somehow truth also being universal.
So with art, I mean, he would have this difference between subjective and objective art, wherein objective art brings about the exact same feeling in each person who sees it, which in that sense we could say, well, then there is this sort of capital T truth, which everyone is connected to. But once again, I would agree with you that to quote like my favorite quotation from one of his followers, and a quotation I think about really often, very often, from Alfred Orage, who says like the last stage of esoteric training is the last stage of esoteric development is just plain common sense. So I think, after everything between both of these thinkers, there's a lot of, what Gurdjieff even has names for these things. He calls them buffers, like as when 2 rail car trains hit, they have a buffer to stop the sort of collision. And he says that you have buffers in you to stop the contradictions coming to the fore. You have ways of self-justifying. You have ways of justifying the things you're identified with. And a lot of what truth is, I think, for both these thinkers is, here is a ton of fuel and exercises and practices, not to develop, but you are developing, but it's almost like you have to clean out all this gunk, and then you finally get back to this very simple truth, which allows you like an intuitive connection to this higher truth. But it will still be from what we could maybe call an essence individual, because each individual, as they grow, is an individual with their own soul, with their own essence. Once again, going back to, I am, quote unquote, James, born in 1994 in the UK with this hereditary background, right? So it's like, my truth is, in relation to that essence, is going to have a subjective tinge, but I don't want to say subjective in the sense of opinion. The objective is going to still be seen from a contextual subject,
from the qualities of your own experience,
exactly,
to a certain extent.
Yeah,
it's really interesting, because a deeper question here, a philosophical question that I've been thinking about a lot lately, is this. I've been working on how to compare some of Steiner's ideas with some of these Shiite, sort of esoteric Shiite philosophers. There are a lot of interesting, from Persia, there's a lot of interesting parallels here in this whole debate over primacy of quiddity or primacy of being, like which relates to the Avicenna, and this whole history of this problem is like, there's an essence to the human, to everything, and then there are the qualities, or the liquidity, and which is first, and which is sort of illusion in a certain sense. And with Steiner, I think that it's like, I would say that he's the essence guy. That there is for him, there's an essence to everything, including human beings, and then there are the qualities to it, which are individual, but in a certain sense, illusory also, and you only perceive these qualities through concepts, through cognition, through sensorium, but behind it is this deeper essence. And if you were to connect with this essence, it's not complicated. It's not manifold. It's a unitary type thing. And it's interesting what you said about this, maybe not common sense. I'm thinking about the word simplicity. It's a sort of simple being that after you clear away all this stuff, after you do all this development, supposedly, then you arrive back at this simple connection with your own essence. And what is available to you in this position is like intuitive knowledge, which is just knowing things based on your own, through your feelings from some source, just there, not in a book, not in conversation, not in rationalizing. But then you also have just a very simplistic experience of the world around you. Like if you look in the Waldorf schools, like what is Steiner having these Waldorf kids do? It's coloring, making art, raking up leaves, doing plays, very like village, almost like village activities or something. What one would do in the village. And I was just reading something about him where he's talking about the Christmas festivals. And he does say that there used to be in the villages, like in these mystery plays of the Passion, the Birth of Jesus and the Three Kings, these plays that they would do in these villages here in Europe. There was just this like naive, simple hobbit, understanding and connection to these things. And, that's what is, that's the reality. And that's like what is lost, So it's just, there's one tweak in him though, because he is trying to help us return to something like that. But then he always comes back with saying, but then there's Armand, there's technology, there's development. And so there's no really returning to that. And some kind of other version is needed, which, he gives his example of what this is supposed to look like for him. And yet it retains many of these more, quote unquote, simplicity or common sense approaches to life that the complex sciences and technology and systems and all this really have no room for,
Our conversation has followed that trajectory, right? You begin with all this complex, really cool, esoteric stuff, and right at the end you go, it's all about just this very simple view. But that simple view is tough to uphold, right?
Yeah,
everything is attempting to attack it. Is there anything we've covered a lot in a short space of time? And I'm just we didn't actually touch on the movements or eurythmy.
We should probably move to that. Yeah.
So both. It's I guess it's of interest that both Steiner and Gurdjieff had this. I don't know all that much about eurythmy, but the movements for Gurdjieff were these what are also known as sacred dances, but the name the movements stuck. Really, it's not. It's a bit of a clunky name, but generally speaking, if I was to explain them to a beginner, you used to play that game when you were younger. Pat your head and rub your belly, or pat your belly and rub your head, where you had this strange sense of your body's wires getting crossed, and all of a sudden you can't do anything. And then it's sort of an innocent game when you're a child, but actually you expand that out into a series of complex dances. What's really happening, with the Gurdjieff's music, which is insane, extremely beautiful, and really does arise in most people who listen to it who are somewhat sensitive, very deep emotional feelings. You have that playing as you're trying to do something with your body, and also you're trying to, so your physical center is working in the sense you're literally moving. Your emotional center is working in the sense that it's receiving this impressions from the music. And your intellectual center is working in the sense that you have to follow these instructions. So all your centers have to find this harmony. And so for Gurdjieff, in a very simple way, the movements even though they've handed down this sacred sense, in a practical sense, they are almost like an enforced practice to draw your centers out. And the great irony is that people would think, almost when you were a kid and you played, to give this example again of pat your head and rub your belly, you find yourself like really tensing up your arms to be able to do it. And you find it's the opposite. You have to allow. You have to just open up and allow each center to just do its own thing. And you realize in that the harmony that Gurdjieff's talking about isn't about you trying to like stick to a line. It's about you opening yourself to a higher will, because you're opening yourself to something more than you, which really is sort of God's will. And yeah, that's what they are, and that's the purpose of them. Is that similar to eurythmy?
I'm trying to think. It's not exactly the same. It's like the same materials here are being used. The body, movements, forms, similar concepts are being used as part of the practice. One difference, again, though, I think is like, the eurythmy developed. Steiner's wife, Marie Steiner, played a very large role in developing these so-called eurythmy movements. Of course, Steiner was also part of this. They developed them together, but she spent a lot more time traveling around doing these eurythmic classes. It was obviously a big, important to her. They staged these things, on the stage at the Goethe Annum and various other places. So it was a little bit more like a performance that you watched, although people did them also, and there was definitely an esoteric philosophy behind them. There were a lot of other people around at the time doing this modern dance spiritual thing, like Louis Fuller, Isadora Duncan, two other famous dancers at the time who had similar ideas about dance, and when they would also perform and things look a little bit similar. And then Rudolf Laban was another choreographer who had very esoteric ideas, and tried to put them into practice in a dance, in a performance. So it sounds like there's a little bit more of a performative element in this Steiner eurythmy. But what's interesting about it, that's especially now, like I'm reading this also from now, like, and then you go back and read the text, but almost 100 years has almost passed since Steiner died, So one thing that's interesting when you go look at some of these eurythmy movements and the gestures you make with the hand is what you find in them frequently is connections to hand signs in many of these secret societies. For example, the Golden Dawn, Freemasonry, also whenever forms of Freemasonry, there's lots of different ones. And many of these groups have hand signs, right, as part of their rituals and so forth. You find some of these hand signs in the eurythmy. Of course, it's not really talked about in this way, but you can compare and see them. And so sometimes people don't even know that's what they're doing, Another thing you find out is that some of the movements you're making are also related to magic squares and older forms of angelic invocation, where you would sort of make a movement on a grid of letters to spell out the name of an angel or something like this. Mm-hmm. And so the hand movements sometimes of these eurythmy are it's doing this similar practice. So it's interesting that it looks like you're watching a performance. It has a philosophy about how the different movements in relation to the music are supposed to represent these subtle, etheric, spiritual forces that you can't see, that are going to then be expressed through the body. And yet built into it is stuff straight from these occult orders, and also from more intense practices of just angelic invocation magic, like from the Middle Ages and so forth. So that's one thing, but I should probably mention that the philosophy behind it that Steiner also talks about is not necessarily for opening the centers, although perhaps it could be. I think there is some of that in there, but it's much more strongly talked about in terms of expressing language and, vowels and making letters with your body. So there's like this whole notion that you can, it's an old, it's an older idea, obviously, that it's about from ancient Judaism and also esoteric forms of Christianity, that, the world was created through language. Everything has a name. There's a kind of secret letter attached to all things, and that language somehow expresses the form of the thing. Mm-hmm. And so through this practice, it's a bit the same in that what it's trying to do is connect you to creation, if we could say the higher will, through language, through vowel recitation, through forming these movements and these expressing language through the body, that it's a particular kind of language. Like if he talks about the letter Aleph, for instance, in Hebrew, he says then there's the Greek letter Alpha, and of course in Arabic also it's called Aleph. And so this was like an expression originally of some kind of creative force or connection, to the creator in this Aleph. He says the Greek language was the last ancient language to still function in this way by calling it Alpha. And so it's an attempt to go back to this like letter mysticism in a certain sense, except that now you do it through the movements and through your body. But I think it is then designed to then develop you in a certain way, by reconnecting you. Like I was thinking about how in certain Sufi groups, the whole spinning thing, which is a little bit maybe like what Gurdjieff was doing, sort of, is like supposed to connect you with God. You remember God through this spinning. And in some like ritual and Hindu ritual performances, this is a little bit more like a dance performance. They make, letters, Sanskrit letters with their hands or things like this. And so it's much more focused on language, it sounds like, than in the Gurdjieff work, but it sounds like it has a similar goal, similar intention.
I think so. I mean, it's all what Gurdjieff would call a conscious shock, something which is so, I mean, you can imagine what a conscious shock is from the words themselves, but it's something to, push you out of sleep once again and make you see yourself, which is sort of the goal of a lot of esoteric work. But as we've been talking, I mean, it's sort of fascinating to me that as far as I'm aware, because, usually at this point of the discussion, I'd say, what can we recommend to people to, go to maybe read about what this discussion is in terms of like a concordance between Gurdjieff and Steiner. And I don't think anything's really been done. I know there's a great book called Beelzebub and the Beast about Gurdjieff and Crowley, and I'm sure there's many books for Steiner and said person, but there's nothing between, not that I know of. I haven't even read any articles on it, in fact.
No, and, I don't think there is anything, partly because of what we said at the beginning, that at least from an academic standpoint, these figures haven't been forgot, but the level of their importance and popularity, I think, was forgotten and is now only realizing like, oh, why maybe we should actually focus on them rather than just rejecting them, So I think that's one thing that's changing. There are some academic articles approaching. I've never seen either just approaching Steiner and Gurdjieff, but you will find sometimes approaching the kind of milieu, of these people. And sometimes Steiner and Gurdjieff will appear together here, but a really good comparison, I don't think in text form and in written form, I don't think there is such a thing yet.
No. What's a good Steiner basics book? Because for Gurdjieff, I guess if people wanted to compare them, I would say for Gurdjieff, I would go a study of Gurdjieff's teaching by Kenneth Walker, which is like, I would say the 200 pages of here is the foundation of Gurdjieff teaching. Is there such a thing for Steiner?
No, I mean, for him, there are biographies of him, which they're mostly historical, There's a good book called The Essential Steiner, is what it's called, by Robert McDermott. I think he wrote this. This is like an anthology, but with the introduction. And this one's pretty good to get a much more broad view, But like if you look at some of, Steiner didn't write 6,000 things. He wrote only like 10 things. The rest was all lectures, And so some of his written works are difficult, but a good place to start. Like, the three stages of knowledge, I think is one, intuition, inspiration, and imagination. His book, Theosophy, is where you get all the basics. So I'd probably say start with the book Theosophy by him. And it's not about the Theosophical Society. It's about, Theosophy as a practice for spiritual development, as a worldview. So I would probably just say start with that one.
Okay. Well, we covered a lot of ground. It's a good place to finish up. Aaron French, once again, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.